Hi, this is Kowski, and in this review video, we're going to be looking at Unit 4, specifically with respect to political ideology and political culture. So here is our learning objective, and let's start off first with political culture, and by definition, this refers to a distinctive and patterned way of thinking about how political and economic life ought to be carried out. And this is going to vary by country and region in the world. For example, in the United States, Americans believe, generally speaking, more strongly in political equality than economic equality. Whereas if you look in European countries, which have more socialistic elements such as universal health care, that is a very distinct difference. So again, the culture at the end of the day is going to be different, and as a result, that's going to affect the way that the government basically carries out policy. Which policies are going to be implemented, which ones are not. And Americans have had a very divisive reaction when it comes to universal health care, gun control. Those are, of course, some of the major hot topics. And what impacts our thinking is, of course, our political culture. So some of the major components of American political culture that you definitely need to familiarize yourself with are individualism, equality of opportunity. Note that I put here not economic equality, so that the idea that everybody should have the opportunity to make it economically in the United States, and that sometimes comes down to how hard you work with respect to individualism. And also connected with that, of course, is free enterprise. The idea that you have the right in a free market without limited government involvement to start your own business, pursue capitalism. Certainly that has been entrenched in the United States. In addition, the idea of rule of law, that everybody has to obey the law and the law is applied equally, and that, again, nobody's above the law. And then finally, limited government, and this is a huge part of American political culture, that the restrictions placed on the government should be protecting individual rights and liberties. And certainly we see a number of areas in which there is limited government. Think, for example, the Bill of Rights. The American government cannot just censor your speech because they don't like it, right? The Bill of Rights is there to protect your speech. Or the fact that we have separation of powers so that one branch does not become more dominant over another, to ensure that we do not ever morph into a dictatorship, right? That is limited government. So these are the key elements here that you should certainly be aware of going into the AP exam with respect to political culture. And when you really look at attitudes between economic equality in the United States and Europe, you'll see a stark difference with respect to some of these questions here. For example, hard work guarantees success. In the United States, 63% agree, yet you look at some of these European countries, especially Germany, 38% only agree. So certainly that idea of individualism and economic equality, right, that's going to be varying by the country. Government should not guarantee every citizen food and basic shelter. Well, in the United States, it's only about a third of Americans. In Great Britain, 9%. So again, in these European countries, it's much, much lower. And that, of course, is because of political culture and about one's beliefs with respect to what the role of the government should be. So, looking at public opinion, well, it's very clear that with respect to public opinion, what the polls reveal about Americans' political information. Well, Americans actually really don't know too much about politics. They may know their basic beliefs, but not really how it affects policies of government. But one thing that is certain that has been shown through public opinion has been the steady decline in trust in the government. And that stems from a number of different issues. Really, the 1960s is a huge turning point when it comes to the decline of trust. You have things like the Vietnam War, the Watergate scandal, and that essentially erodes the trust. Many Americans today have distrustful feelings in the government. If you look in the 1950s, 1940s, around World War II, you'll see that American trust was actually pretty high, much more than it is today. But again, 2/3 of Americans distrust their government. Trust actually had gone up slightly after September 11th, but then began to stagnate and decline to prehistoric normal levels, if you will. But overall, today, Americans still distrust their government. So as I was telling you before, when you look at trust historically, up until about the 1960s, about 73% of people trusting their government under Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and then notice really the Vietnam War, Watergate, that's going to really bring it down. And again, you have fluctuations here and there. You see like September 11th, for example, it moves up a little bit higher, but then again declines once again. So trust has certainly not been a major component in our American government. And again, for some of the reasons you see here from Watergate, Vietnam, and even with Bill Clinton. So understanding public opinion. Certainly many Americans actually have no opinion about the scope of government. What does that even mean? Well, what should the role be of the government with respect to certain policies? Sometimes public opinion is very inconsistent, which you'll have conflicting policies, which is known as policy gridlock. So Americans select leaders, but do they do so wisely? Well, oftentimes people tend to vote more for performance rather than policy. So for example, is the candidate good looking? Unfortunately, that is a very superficial characteristic. However, candidates that tend to be larger or may not look like the normal typical candidate actually could be harmed in the voting that results in the election day. So unfortunately, at the end of the day, people tend to vote more for performance rather than policy. Nevertheless, moving on to our next learning objective, we're going to be looking at how do we come to our political beliefs. So if I were to ask you, where do you stand on these issues? Pick any issue. And I would ask you, did you really come to that stance by yourself? Well, probably not. Welcome to politics. How you come to formulate your political beliefs is when you go through a process known as political socialization. And this is the process through which an individual acquires his or her political orientation. And this happens over time. And of course, with age, your orientation towards an ideology, whether it's being a libertarian, a socialist, a conservative, or liberal, is going to grow firmer with age. And at the end of the day, public opinion is the end result of this process. For example, where do you stand on these issues that you saw in the previous slide? But really, most of the political socialization is done informally, right? You pick it up, you absorb it, you acquire it. Chances are your parents never sat you down and said, hey, son or daughter, one of the reasons why we're a Republican is because of A, B, and C, right? That typically doesn't happen. What probably does happen is, well, dinner table conversations, or what you might hear from your parents talking, what news channel your parents might be watching, sources of information that they use. These are all ways in which you pick up beliefs and you begin to internalize them. But the family has the biggest impact on children over time. So chances are your political orientation is very, very similar to your parents. So for example, if both parents are Democrats, you would typically have about a 59% chance of being a Democrat yourself. Again, this is not an exact science by any means, because you see here that with both parents being Democratic, well, 13% actually became Republican. Or if both parents are Republican, only 12% became Democratic. So again, but the general correlation here is if your parents are of the same political persuasion, well, again, that would be done for you as well. The media is very important, and of course there's a separate chapter just on the media, which we won't really go into, but we'll talk about how that is important with respect to political socialization. That is, of course, the chief source of information as children age. And of course there is a generation gap in viewing television. News television typically has higher rates of people watching the news who are older, whereas younger people are more morphing towards the internet, websites, YouTube channels. So this is what we call a linkage institution, because it's linking the policy and the voters and the government all together. Schools are also important in terms of political socialization, but it's important to note that they are not a linkage institution, right? The school is not trying to connect you to policy, whereas the media probably is. It's important to also note that with school, better educated citizens are actually more likely to vote and be more knowledgeable about politics and policy. And one of the things too, especially with college, is there's something called a liberalization effect on college, meaning that people who go to college are more likely to be liberal in their political beliefs. Again, that's not an exact science. It's not going to say 100% of people who go to college are liberals. We know that is certainly not the case, but it tends to have that type of effect. So with respect to your political learning over time, you'll see that turnout with respect to your age actually increases, and that's for a number of reasons. But as your political orientation becomes firmer, that also correlates well with your turnout. So you'll notice that older people tend to vote much more often than younger people who may be apathetic to politics, who may have actually less time compared to older people. But nevertheless, as you age, you tend to have a firmer orientation and you actually tend to vote more. Okay, and lastly, in terms of political socialization influences, events, right? Certain events and social trends do affect political attitudes of the entire population. And this is only a couple of examples here. For example, World War II actually unites the nation, creates a belief of reliability as well as trust in the government. So people are trusting, people are having more faith in their government. But then you'll note how this is going to change in the 60s, especially with the civil rights movement, with the assassination of MLK and Malcolm X. This is going to lead to a period of people challenging the government, right? You have protests, certainly, that are sort of defining the 60s when you think about it. So again, that can certainly socialize people, whether it's to trust their government, whether it's to vote more, whether it's to demonstrate. Certain events are going to certainly motivate people to do certain actions and to believe certain things. All right, so that's where we'll end it for today, and thanks for watching.